as far as the question about competition, and I think this was alluded to by Paul or Victor, the part of the problem is the Cope law itself, right? It's very easy. It's much easier to have real competition when you've got the ability for little guys to get in, and for cable companies, for instance, to have to work pretty hard to get their infrastructure in because they have to deal with local franchising. Same thing if AT&T wanted to provide cable service under the current environment, and there's still some argument about this, they would have to locally franchise. Therefore, getting that infrastructure of all the wires run through town is actually a tricky business. And therefore, there can be some competition because people have to worry about how much money they're going to spend. What the COPE Act does is allow folks to get in really easily because they can do national franchising. And once the national franchising occurs, that's when those folks who provide telephone or cable service can get their duopolies. Because now everybody's got to have telephone, everybody's got to have cable, more or less. And those folks can say, oh, but you want to piggyback on our service, don't talk to these other guys like Volo. You've already got cable in the house, buy from us. If it's hard for those folks to provide, or harder for those folks to provide that service because it's locally controlled, there's more chance for competition to get in. So that's the only argument I would make against your point.
Could you go into a little more detail about what the national franchising entails, what that means?
Sure. Switching hats to my cable commission thing. The COPE Act, and this is what Tim Johnson's letter was referring to, the COPE Act basically says no longer do you need to go to local governments and get a franchise from them to provide cable service. Current environment, AT&T is perfectly welcome to compete for cable service in this town. They choose not to. Because the current environment is they would have to live up to the local franchising agreement that Insight signed. And we welcome them to do that. We'd love that, to have more competition in cable. They don't want to do that. They don't want to compete on those terms. Because local franchising often requires folks to do build-out and do all sorts of other things in the community, like right-of-way agreements and things like that, that they don't really want to have to live up to. They've had a pretty easy time before. Once the COPE Act goes through, if it does, we hope it doesn't, that would mean that there could be a national franchise controlled only by the FCC, not by local governments. And those big players like AT&T and Insight could simply say, well, we don't want to deal with the local government, we're going to go get on board and we're going to provide service to Champaign-Urbana based on the national franchise agreement. Given that, it's much easier for them to get in, and they don't, contrary to what Tim Johnson would have you believe, don't have to do things like build out to all communities. They can discriminate against certain communities that they think are less profitable. That gives them more of a foot in and allows them to then corner the market on telecommunications and cable service and eventually internet service, which is why we always want net neutrality piggybacking on the COPE Act.
So well said.
So doesn't that then open another competitive door where now the local people are, the local cable commission is encouraged to promote local providers so that they can provide a more effective competition?
The problem is that telephone companies and cable companies are effectively utilities because pulling the cable is a hard problem. And as with the Brand X decision, cable companies are not required to provide common carrier wires to everybody else. So more and more what we end up with is a utility, something that should be regulated because we have to give them right-of-way and poles and wires to people's houses and the ability to pull all that fiber underground. We have more and more buildup of those big companies who can just come in and say, well, we've already got those wires here, so we're going to provide the service, and less ability for new folks to kind of come in edgewise because they no longer have the U.S. government saying, hey, you've got to get a common carrier, you've got to provide these wires to these other folks who want to come in and So it never happens if they have free reign to use their current infrastructure that was paid for by taxpayers long ago to now provide internet service.
So I'd like to get the academic and Paul, can you start on?
Well, if you go back to when common carriage laws were first